Following program may be pre-recorded.
Good morning, and welcome to Connections Radio Show, where we talk about ideas that matter. I'm glad you've made the connection and are with us today. I'm Laurie Fitz, your host, and the goal of our show is to explore a wide range of topics that challenge us to see ourselves, our community, and the world around us in ways that get us thinking, get us talking, get us imagining, get us connected, and perhaps inspired or challenged to do just a bit more because we've made the connection. Our topic today is debriefing from Election Day and what's next in our nail-biting Who Won continuing story. And to set this conversation up, I went back to our Star Tribune and I looked at the Tuesday, the Wednesday, and Thursday headlines and articles. So I'm going to take you back to Tuesday when we were all, finishing up, getting those votes in. I voted early. Several of my friends voted early. But those who didn't, made sure that they got out the vote on Tuesday. And top line was threats, fear, suspicion, build to Election Day. And it talks about Trump toying with the announcing of the 2024 bid on the eve of midterm voting. And voters go to the polls Tuesday after a campaign season so filled with conspiracy theories and lies that officials worry they will undermine the confidence in the election no matter how the balloting goes. Although early voting has been largely uneventful, 40 million Americans had already cast their ballots. The sign of the strain are everywhere. A court ordered armed activists to stop patrolling drop boxes in Arizona. Tens of thousands of voter registrants were challenged in Georgia. Voting right groups trained volunteers in de-escalation methods. Voters were videotaped by groups hunting for fraud as they drop off their ballots. So even the GOP officials say that they are bracing for a renewed onslaught after Election Day, one most likely to be fueled by their own party. I felt like I've been stabbed in the back repeatedly so much that I don't have anything but scar tissue, said Clint Hickman, who is a Republican on the Board of Supervisors in the Maricopa County, Arizona, home of Phoenix. So we went in on Tuesday with a lot of fears, and rightly so. Democracy was on the ballot, and the crazies of what could possibly happen was right there in front of us. Wednesday, big headline, walls in a walk. Exciting. We see that the GOP takeover appears uncertain. Democrats were bracing to defend their slim majority in the House of Representatives and the Senate in Tuesday as an anxious nation rendered its midterm verdict on President Joe Biden's leadership and his party. Walz, this was great. Tim Walz won a second term as our Minnesota governor on Tuesday night. Walz's win defied a challenging midterm environment for his own party and followed a tumultuous first term, during which he contended with the COVID-19 pandemic and the destruction in Minneapolis that followed the George Floyd killing. So we had Walz in a walk, and then by Thursday, huge DFL wins full control. State Capitol, major prize in election sweep. We get this beautiful, it's still pretty divided, but a beautiful rendition of how the state capitol has both our Senate and House turned blue. So we have a trifecta. And what looked to be the most important thing, the Roe ruling, remapping, turned the tide. Heading into the election night, Minnesota Democrats braced for what was predicted the red wave that would give Republicans control of the legislature and deny Governor Tim Walz a second term. That wave never materialized. So what a week. Absolutely heart pounding, and it still is in terms of what's going to happen next. So on Connections Radio, we always like to create an interesting connection to have us look at ideas in new and powerful ways. So our connections today is I'm going to be connecting us with a Virginia member of the Virginia Now, that's not like northern Minnesota, Virginia. This is like the state of Virginia. The Virginia member of the Virginia House of Delegates from their 48th district, Rip Sullivan. Richard Sullivan, we all know him as Rip, is an American activist serving as a member in the Virginia House of Delegates. And that area encompasses what you may have heard of in Arlington and Fairfax counties. And he is a strong member of the Democratic Party. And Rip has lived in McLean for almost 50 years. Rip and his wife, Beth, are both graduates of Langley High School. Now, I have to do a true confession here. Rip and I were both in McLean, Virginia during our high school years, and I know both Rip and his wife, Beth, and I am delighted that Rip has agreed to be with us today. Welcome, Rip.
Good morning, Laurie. It is really great to talk to you this morning.
It is great. 45 years ago, we were in high school, we graduated, and, back then I don't think I would have thought that 45 years from then that you and I would be on a radio show talking about politics.
It would have been hard to predict, that's for sure. We have some mutual friends who we're still friends with who love to talk about how they've been voting for me, though, for 45 years because I was class president as long ago as 45 years ago. So
yes, you were, and we're very proud
I
of
always
that.
had a political itch. I always had that political itch.
Well, you've also fought to make Virginia stronger, cleaner, safer, more equitable for Virginians, and I'm very proud of the work that you do. And throughout the show, I'm just going to have you talk a little bit about some of the things that you have done in Virginia that are so closely aligned with the DFL that I am going to pronounce that you are an honorary DFLer.
Oh, my. That is an honor. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
I accept.
Absolutely. And I hope this will be the first of many conversations that we can have with our sister state of Virginia and having us look at what are the things that we can each learn from each other in our politics of how we create change in a progressive way. So with that, I'd like to start with us talking about that red wave. The red wave never showed up, and the predictive polls completely missed it. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts are that I'm glad I'm not a pollster. I think it's the last 5 years have been rough for the polling industry because there are a lot of things happening in politics in the United States, candidly around the world, which are just hard to measure, at least in the ways that the pollsters have typically done it. The red wave that was predicted that everyone, at least on the Democratic side of the aisle, feared, clearly was not there. At least when you're talking globally, as in the big picture. But as well as I, there are places in Minnesota, there are places in Virginia, there are places nationally that are bright red, and if you look at a map of Minnesota, if you look at a map of Virginia on a square foot basis, right, in terms of land mass, Virginia and Minnesota look like red states.
Yep.
But when you look at it from an electoral perspective in terms of number of votes, both certainly Minnesota and in my view Virginia are red states or are blue states or bluish states, and it's all at the margins, right? I've been talking to people a lot about the Senate and how excited we are that I'm knocking wood as I say this that we've got a great chance to hang on to the United States Senate. But I will tell you, if we don't, God forbid we don't, the fact that there wasn't a red wave will be cold comfort.
Right.
I mean, once you get control of the chamber, how you got that control really is relegated to history and the stuff for political scientists and political operatives to look at. I mean, I'm reminded, what do they call the person who finishes last in their med school class? Well, they call her doctor.
Exactly.
Right? What are they going to call Mitch McConnell? if he wins, if he wins this race by the skin of his teeth, they're going to call him leader. So he won't care very much that there wasn't a red wave.
But he's got a pretty tough road to hoe in terms
He does.
of even if it does win. I've great hopes for Nevada. Nevada seems interesting in that some of the votes that have been coming at the end, they thought would be more trending to the Republican, but haven't. So we're discovering as we go in Nevada. What's your thought about Nevada?
Well, I've been glued to these numbers just like everyone else. I'm looking at them right now. It looks to me like the candidates right now, Senator Cortez Masto is 850 votes behind.
Wow.
So it is an effective tie, and I've got a story to tell about a tie vote if you want to get into it later. But there are a lot of votes still to count. And if any of your listeners have been watching, these returns on pick your outlet, CNN, MSNBC, frankly, even Fox. It's all going to depend on where and how these last votes came in.
Yeah.
But I like our chances of hanging on in Nevada, and that, of course, would be a great relief, making the special in Georgia still very, very important, but not the absolute pivot point that it was 2 years ago.
It was definitely nail-biting back then, and having both get elected 2 years ago was joyful. Just before, unfortunately, January 6th, which sort of took some of the joy away from the recognition that we had won the Senate. The challenge that I see in Georgia, I am puzzled to begin with about the struggle in Georgia. I just don't see how, unless it's just been doubled down so many times, that Herschel Walker is, seeming to be placed on some sort of pedestal when the very things that he stands for in terms of, talking about abortion and talking about all of the conservative, does not seem to portray that in his own life. But it doesn't seem like the hypocrisy matters.
Well, on the one hand, that of course seems shocking. On the other hand, if you think back 4 years ago when Donald Trump was elected, or I guess now 5 years ago, we were all saying precisely the same thing. How could he? How did he survive that video coming out? How did he survive the famous bus? Exactly. In politics, as we knew it up to that moment in American history, Donald Trump committed numerous politically fatal acts during that race and things that came out about his life. And candidly, I was in the camp of folks who just did not believe he was electable.
Huh. I hope
but it
that
happened, and it may be that the most truthful thing he said in that election, or the most prescient thing he said during that election, was that he could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody who could still win the election. He had that kind of celebrity, he had that kind of hold over certainly his voters, and then eventually over all Republican voters because they were so afraid of him. And the Walker phenomenon seems to me to be related. Born of that same sort of thing, the celebrity that he has. We've all known that he was going to get well north of 40%. The question is, could he get up to 50%? And now, or at least potentially, depending on what happens in Nevada, the race would not be from the Republicans' perspective so much. It would Herschel Walker be a good senator? The question that the Republican strategy will pose to voters is, let's elect Herschel Walker because he will block Joe Biden. That would be the motivating factor. They could elect a rock.
They may be surprised in that if he is such a Trump devotee, Trump has not been a good happy player with the Republican Party.
Team player. Yeah.
So who knows what they get?
The most important vote that any legislator, whether you're at my level in the state legislature or at the federal level in Congress, the most important vote that legislator ever casts is when you're organizing the body. Whose side are you going to vote for Mitch McConnell, or at least a Republican? Are you going to caucus with the Republicans or not? Hard to believe that Herschel Walker or, God forbid, Adam Laxalt wouldn't. And that changes everything.
Mm-hmm.
All the chairmanships, all of who controls the rules, who controls what bills get to the floor. Forget about how they might vote on one thing or another. When you give one party or the other the control, the steering wheel, if you will, they get to control the agenda. They get to control what potentially at least comes out of any chamber. Unless and until Herschel Walker were to say, "I'm going to vote for Chuck Schumer instead of Mitch McConnell," frankly, as I said, that is the most consequential vote that he would cast. But I hate talking about Herschel Walker even theorizing that he might be casting any votes in the United States Senate.
It just continues.
I'm confident that Senator Warnock will win that if it comes to that.
I believe he will, and I believe that when it comes down to just the vote between them, that there's not going to be a big change from what people have already voted. Plus, I think it'll be strengthened. That's my hope.
The scary part to my way of thinking is obviously there's been a lot made of the fact that Walker dramatically underperformed Brian Kemp by I think several 100,000 votes, if I have this right. And so what happens in a runoff to those Republicans who voted for Kemp but did not vote for Walker? Do they come back? Do any of them come back? Do enough of them come back? Motivated by, as I said, the national political implications rather than the actual merits of his candidacy.
They may not even want to vote.
They may not. Well, that'd be fine with me.
Yeah, that would be fine with me as well.
Stay home.
And with that, we'll wrap up this segment. And you are listening to AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. And we're going to continue our conversation about what's next for our country and our elections. So stay with us. We'll be back just after a few great announcements and commercials. Welcome back to Connections Radio Show, where we talk about ideas that matter. So glad you joined us today. We're having a debrief in one way of what happened on November 8th and a looking forward, still kind of biting our fingernails as to what's next. And joining us today is Rip Sullivan. Rip is both an activist in the DFL, I call him DFL already, in the Democratic Party. We've made Rip an honorary Minnesota DFL. And it's just great to get perspective from other states as we look to what the future of our democracy will be in this election, as well as just lessons learned. I'm going to actually start with that, Rip. I know we talked about maybe having it a little later in the program, but I think it's so important. You worked very hard in your state legislature for your House delegates to turn that blue. I'd love to have you share that story and how you worked at that and some lessons learned for us to be thinking about. Because right now, the DFL party is pretty excited that we've got the trifecta and that we've won full control. And you've gone through that wonderful taste of trifecta, but you've also learned some lessons.
I have, and congratulations, by the way, to Minnesotans and to the DFL for taking the trifecta. I know what a heavy lift that is. Just to give you some background, Laurie, and for your listeners, Virginia has been trending blue. I don't need to give you an exegesis on redistricting, but we were operating under maps that had been drawn by a huge Republican majority in the Virginia legislature. So we really had to claw our way back. And I was actually the campaign chair for the House Democratic Caucus in the 2017 and 2019 cycles. And those dates are going to sound odd to your listeners, but that's because Virginia holds its state elections and its local elections in the off years, the odd years. So Virginia has if you can believe it, elections every year.
Oh my gosh!
Federal, in even years, all the state elections, gubernatorial on down in odd years, and it is exhausting. It is absolutely an issue we face as voters. Simply wish they could take a break. But we, in 2017 race, the Democrats in the House of Delegates, which has 100 members, were down around. I think I was number 34. So we were deeply mired in the minority. We won 15 seats that year that really was a wave election.
Yeah.
And then 2 years later, in 2019, we got over the top and won another 6 races and had a 55-seat majority paired with a very slim Senate majority.
And can I put you on pause for just a second and share who you got elected that was just so heart-renderingly beautiful? Tell us about some of the folks that you got elected.
Oh, my goodness. During those 4 years as we were expanding into the majority, it was just so gratifying because the Virginia House of Delegates started to really look like Virginia.
Yeah. We
elected more women to the point that we now actually have a majority women caucus in the House Dems. We have more people of color. We are truly a citizen legislature in Virginia. We meet even less often than the Minnesota legislature. All of us have jobs, and so we elected teachers, we elected farmers, we elected nurses, people from all walks of life. We can claim the first Latina elected, the first Asian American elected. So it was just remarkable how suddenly the House began to look much more like Virginia. So we took the trifecta in 2019 and had the majority in 20 and 21. So we stood where you all are now. And I will tell you that from my perspective, new majorities are wonderful, but they are they're really hard for a variety of reasons. One, there's the issue that they have been in power in a while, and there's sort of a learning curve. But more importantly, there will be always a temptation to do everything all at once.
Mm-hmm.
You can, and so the theory is you should. On the other hand, particularly in today's politics, which can ping pong so rapidly, my advice to the DFL would be choose your battles and think through whether, in fact, you do want to do everything at once. And it's a very difficult decision-making process because you don't want to get to the end to the end of the session where you might face losing the majority and not have done something really dramatic. And we did a huge number of previously unthinkable things in Virginia. We abolished the death penalty. We passed a groundbreaking energy policy, getting us on the path to clean energy by 2045. We made it so much easier to vote in Virginia that we rocketed to the top of the list in terms of doing away with these restrictive, some would say Jim Crow election laws. We engaged in a great deal of criminal justice reform. We passed the ERA. We did things that just had been unthinkable literally months earlier. And I believe, really brought Virginia forward in a progressive way, in a way that was very, very gratifying. The end of the story, as you've sort of previewed for your viewers or your listeners, is that last year we lost the majority. And we are now working hard to get it back. I have a GIF that I attach to texts and emails these days, which is an animation of Sisyphus watching his boulder roll back down to the bottom of the mountain, which is kind of how I feel. We gotta pick ourselves up, dust ourselves off, and next year, 2023, we need to win frankly, just a couple of seats, and we will get the majority back, and that's the plan. But it was frustrating.
And to emphasize how closely aligned your policies and what you find is important with what the DFL party is. It's just the equitable economy. You fought hard to make sure that there's workforce training programs, strengthening public schools, sustainable Virginia with getting a rebate program for purchasing or leasing electric vehicles and getting the school buses to have that electric. And also the scourge of gun violence. I know that you are a parent who attended not only the public schools, but your son went to Virginia Tech. So
he did, and going to that memorial for the people killed in the Virginia Tech shooting is just incredibly moving. This is Virginia, where the NRA and the CDL, Citizens Defense League, hold a tight grip on things. We have open carry and all sorts of lenient gun laws, but we were able to pass while we had the majority. A bunch of gun safety legislation. I've carried something called the Red Flag Law, which we now have in Virginia, which provides a mechanism for people who are worried about a loved one or someone, a neighbor who might be at risk of harm to themselves or others, to get to go to court and get that gun taken away from that person, at least temporarily, until that risk goes away. So just a lot of really exciting and terrific progressive things. I'm not here to tell your listeners that because we did that, we lost the majority.
No.
Because I don't think that's what happened. But that certainly, in some way, it was a part of the soup that ended up losing us the majority. And one of the things I hope we talk about before the end of the hour is these incredibly thin margins, whether we're talking about a House of Delegates race here in Virginia or whether we're talking about a Senate race or, for that matter, a presidential race. Mm-hmm. The difference between us being in the majority today, the 3 seats that took us from 51 down to 48, you add up the margins in each of those, and you're at less than 1,000 votes. So 3 seats, less than 1,000 votes, tips the balance of power in a chamber.
And I find it interesting in maybe there's something about the voters seeming to want that. I mean, they want us to have debate. They want us to work through and not be partisan. I think Biden's gotten kind of a bum rap, but the things that he's done in a bipartisan way has been pretty amazing. So it's complicated. It's complicated with why people vote the way they did and how did COVID impact that feeling and what kind of cultish behavior came out of the fear of COVID and the denial of COVID as well as denial of voting. I have run over, and I usually do this, but it's such a good conversation. I don't want to stop. But we will come back. You are listening to AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota, and I promise we'll continue our conversation soon. Welcome back to Connections Radio Show. I'm Laurie Fitz, your host, and our topic today is looking at our election day and our elections. We haven't quite made up our mind yet, or we haven't quite been able to count all the votes to know exactly who's won. But we do know here in Minnesota that we've got the trifecta and the DFL wins full control. And our guest today is a member of the Virginia House of Delegates, and that's not our northern Minnesota, Virginia. This is the state of Virginia. And he's able to give us some perspective on many of the goals and ideas that we're struggling with here in Minnesota and how he has been working with the state legislature in Virginia to make a difference. And we're so glad that you're with us today, Rip.
Thank you, Laurie.
Absolutely.
This has been a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to the rest of it. Yeah.
It is fun. So we ended with talking about we're so close. It's a divide. No matter who wins, it's a divided country, a divided state in terms of just 1,000 or less votes determining who takes control. But you made the point in the last segment about how that control is really important, because it really does determine how committees are formed, how priorities are set out. So there is good reason to continue our nail biting and not knowing exactly where we're going. But I do take some solace in that it feels like democracy in the voting polls won, and that folks looked at extremism and said, I don't think so. Is it a referendum on Trump? Well, they've had, he's had 3 cycles of losing, and I think even the Wall Street Journal called him a loser. And of course, he hates that more than anything else. Is it a referendum, on crazy politics and liars, or is there something resonating with Biden at a deeper level that allows us to go, well, he's at least making sense and he's portraying a view of the future? And I think his speech that he did, that was a rallying about what does democracy mean, may have stirred both Democrats and Republicans. What's your thought?
Yeah, I think that's fair. There was a raging debate within the Democratic Party nationally and all around the country as to whether that was the right strategy, simply because the Republicans had tried to make the election about, quote, kitchen table or pocketbook issues. And I think if there were, if you were meeting with someone who makes their living as a political strategist, he or she would tell you that those are the kinds of issues that motivate voters. Mm-hmm. Inflation. There's just it wasn't exactly rocket science as to why the Republicans were focusing on inflation. It wasn't exactly rocket science as to why the Republicans were focusing on crime. Those are the kinds of issues that typically, historically, have moved voters. But voting is an emotional decision, probably more than a rational decision. Mm-hmm. And I do think that we're going to find that the democracy issue in the president's speech and other people who were talking about it around the country was at least a key part of why this red wave did not materialize, because I do think that what we've seen over the course of the last year, the last several years, has got people nervous. I had an interaction. I'll take 90 seconds to tell you this story.
Please do.
I was during the last session of the General Assembly when the war in Ukraine had broken out, and one of my colleagues from the other side of the aisle got up one day and started bemoaning the fact that he'd filled up his truck, and it cost him $70 or something. And so this turned into a speech about how Joe Biden was responsible for gas prices going up and that sort of thing. That very next morning, I was watching CNN, and the woman who is the Speaker of the Ukrainian Parliament was interviewed. I believe her last name is Uksanova. Mm-hmm. And she was urging at that point, this is back in February, she was urging the United States to do more in terms of shutting off Russian gas and that sort of thing. And she looked into the camera and she said, I know that Americans are worried about paying a few more cents at the pump, but Ukrainians are dying. Our children and our fathers and our brothers are dying. And it just put the whole thing in perspective. And I gave a speech about it on the floor that very day, not belittling the difficulties that Americans were facing, particularly when it came to their pocketbooks, but at least asking people to put things in perspective and to recognize that our democracy is still something that the world looks to, that Ukrainians want to be like, want to preserve, and we need to preserve our democracy. And I think that has resonated with an awful lot of Americans because of what we've seen and experienced over the course of the last 5 years.
And I think to assume that voters are just going to care about inflation on the whole. Of course, I can see, a politician getting up there and trying to, create, anger and frustration. But on the whole, we're much more complicated, I think, than polls or we ourselves give credit to in terms of voting. Yeah, I think suburban women very much look at inflation. They look at, crime. but they also care about their right to have to make their own decisions about their body. And they care about Ukraine. They care about lots of things. And I think Warnock said it, I thought, best, and it's in line with what you were saying about, a vote is a hope, but it's also a prayer. I mean, it's a deeply spiritual, what do we want to be? Who are we? And what do we want and we are the leaders in that moment when we go into that voting ballot box. We are our country's leaders. How do we want to lead? And what does our vote mean is very powerful. And yes.
It is. I will tell you, I walked into one polling place on Tuesday, and there were two members of the Ukrainian parliament there as observers, trying to learn about democracy from the United States. And it was unbelievably inspiring that despite all of our difficulties, we're still the place that the world comes to try to see how democracy works. I think you are exactly right. I think trying to look for one reason that the wave didn't happen is a bit of a fool's errand. I think the history books will show that it was a variety of different reasons, including the Dobbs decision. There's just no question that while the election drew near, a lot of pollsters said, it seems to be falling off the radar screen. I just don't think that's right. I think it was crucial to, again, at the margins in some races, some very important races, to women and men who support those women.
Absolutely. They say that there's about 30% of the voters across the board, 30% of the voters listed that as number one. So I think
that's a big number.
People didn't talk about it maybe, but it was inside our hearts that this is just wrong. And we reacted to it being wrong. I'm having such a wonderful time with our conversation. I keep running over. So I need to make sure that we can have a fourth segment. So stay with us to continue our conversation. We'll be wrapping up our Virginia-Minnesota conversation about what's next in just a few short minutes. Thanks for staying with us. Welcome back to Connections Radio Show, where we talk about ideas that matter and we make the connections. I'm Laurie Fitz, your host, and our topic today has been looking at debriefing as well as looking to the future as to what's next with who's going to win and who's going to have the majority, our continuing story. And joining us is a state of Virginia, member of the Virginia House of Delegates, and Rip Sullivan oversees the 48th District of both Arlington and Fairfax counties. Welcome, Rip. We're so glad you've been here today.
Thanks, Laurie. Thanks very much for having me.
Oh, it's great. Great stuff. I want to end with more lessons learned. And I want to start with, of course, I was so enamored with Fetterman winning Pennsylvania. Bobby Kennedy once said, when you have a problem, you put your lantern to that problem. And Fetterman did. Here's this guy who has this major stroke. And in other elections in the past, that may have eliminated him completely, but he owned it. He embraced it. And he was the guy that got knocked down and got up again. And I think Pennsylvania resonated with that over the slick Dr. Oz. And I have to say, it brought tears when I saw that he won. I thought it was amazing.
I think you're right. From a pure political, operative, tactical perspective, they made a very gutsy decision with respect to that debate.
Yeah.
Not doing the debate obviously had a huge downside and opened them up to criticism and attack.
And a mystery, like how bad is it?
Yeah, well, precisely.
Yeah.
He won't debate. Why won't he debate?
Right.
Doing the debate, of course, opened him up to sort of a different line of attack. So it was a huge decision. I don't want to call it a gamble, but it had lots of risks. And I hope you are right. I think you are right. That what it ultimately did was humanize him even more. He's obviously, let's just put it out there. He is not your quote typical politician, whatever that means.
No.
And,
traditional. He's not the traditional.
Traditional. That's a better word. But I'd like to think that what he is someone whom everyone knows in one way or another, right? Everyone has a family member who's had a challenge of some kind. In this case, a health challenge, and it made him real and relatable even more than he was before. So I think it ended up helping him, and I'm like you. I'm just thrilled. I have deep family roots in Pennsylvania, and I'm just thrilled about what's happening there. And it's not going to change. I mean, the 2024 election starts now.
Yep.
And not surprisingly, Pennsylvania is going to be in the middle of that. And how great that Pennsylvania now also has a trifecta.
Yeah.
Because they took back their house as well. And that's just going to redound to everyone's benefit as the next presidential election looms.
It's been a pivot state.
So congratulations to Pennsylvania.
Yes. Big shout out. Shout out to Pennsylvania and to Fetterman and the voters who made that happen.
I should add that the fellow running the House, the Pennsylvania House strategy, was the fellow who helped us here in Virginia, and he's a remarkably talented young man who now has 2 chamber flips to his credit. So
interesting.
He's got a bright future.
Well, we only have a couple minutes left, and I just wanted to leave some time for you to have some closing thoughts on where you think we're going to go from here, and any other advice you have for Minnesota from your perspective in the work that you've been doing in Virginia.
Oh my!
Yeah,
a softball like that, with only a few minutes, that's a real challenge. I do sense that we may finally be at a pivot point with respect to Trump. Here in Virginia, we've actually had a couple members of the General Assembly and our lieutenant governor essentially throw him over the railing, saying we're done with him. He's why we lost, and they're ready to move on from him. And my own view is Donald Trump could get hit by a bus tomorrow, and we would still have the same problems we have now in terms of what's going on in the Republican Party and what he has done to the Republican Party. And there's a part of me that doesn't want the Republican Party to be able to pivot and simply say, "Oh, who's Donald Trump? We've abandoned him. Look at us now," because they need to be held accountable for
enabling. For enabling him. And they're going to win primaries, but maybe not the election. And maybe that's the big wake-up call for them to be thinking through.
I think you're exactly right. Now, neither can we turn 2024 into, if he were to not be the nominee, there would be a temptation to try to sort of make him the nominee in terms of running against Trump.
And I'm going to have you back because I've got like 13 seconds now.
There we go.
So we'll come back and we'll talk about the election of 2024. You've been a joy. Thank you so much for joining us today.
I'll be watching what you do with great interest up there. Thanks,
all right.
Laurie.
Take care. Have a great one. And thanks for joining us on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota.